Chapter 28. Home again. With only a few hours' rest, Todd paced, unable to sit still, the image of Angelique's abduction playing out again and again in his mind. He and Ken were confined inside a room that was once a shower, illuminated by chem lights so that the armed guards at the entrance could keep watch over them. Todd quickly came to the conclusion that there wasn't anything that could have been done, except die had they attempted to prevent her from being taken. Looking around the room in the dim light, Todd thought about what to do now. He moved from one end to the other, looking for anything that might help in their escape, but saw only 2 cots and Ken. They sure picked the right place to put them, Todd thought, as he looked over to the guards watching the shower. At that moment he realized that the only way they were getting out was to take down the 2 guards. Although he didn't want to kill or hurt them, it was the only option. Todd turned his attention to Ken, who was resting on the cot along the wall. Taking a seat on his own cot near Ken's head, Todd made slow movements so as not to draw the guard's attention. Reaching out with his right hand, he nudged Ken on his shoulder. "How can you be sleeping?" he asked, disgusted by the thought of resting while Angelique was being held prisoner somewhere else. "I haven't been asleep for hours now," Ken replied calmly. "What are you doing then?" Todd asked, not believing Ken's response. "You sure picked a bad time to start getting all chatty. I have been listening to the guards. They're getting tired. If both of us are up moving around, then they're going to pay closer attention to what we are doing. So sit down and shut up. I'll tell you when we should move." Ken spoke softly to keep his voice from echoing off the shower walls. Todd almost felt sorry for doubting him, but not as much as he hated not coming to the same realization first. A half-hour passed as Todd tried to contain his need to jump into action. Sitting on his cot, he willed his body to appear calm and at rest, while in his thoughts he played out what his actions would be when the time came. From Ken's position on the cot, with his feet facing the guards at the entrance, he watched them through slightly opened eyes and listened to the conversations they had about how tired they were. Always having a good sense of time, he figured it was around 4 a.m., and knew that standing guard staring at people resting made it difficult to stay awake, even when standing up. Many times over the last hour, he had seen one of the guards nod off and catch himself before collapsing to the floor. The time was nearing. "Get ready," Ken said softly, as he turned slowly onto his side. Todd slowly opened his eyes, as his heart began beating faster. Without another word, Ken placed one foot over the side of the cot, and then the other. Reaching out with his right hand, he placed it on the floor and began to apply his body weight in an attempt to keep the cot from squeaking. Once free of the cot, and in a runner's stance on the floor, Ken looked up at Todd. "I go first." Seeing Todd's slight nod in the dim light, Ken brought his attention back to the guard at the door, whose face was now angled down to the floor with his eyes closed. Rocking back on his right leg, Ken launched forward while pushing off the floor with both hands. As Ken gained speed, Todd jumped up from his cot and followed. Ken targeted the guard's midsection with his shoulder. Only feet away, Ken began lowering his head for the impact, catching a glimpse of the soldier as he raised his head from his standing sleep. Before the soldier fully woke, he found himself breathless and flying through the air as if he had been hit by a cannonball. Todd quickly followed, exiting the shower room a second behind Ken. Making a hard right, Todd could see the second guard with his pistol raised to fire at Ken. While still making the turn, Todd pivoted off his right leg, bringing his left up to the pistol in the hands of the second guard. Making contact just under the soldier's grip on the pistol, it fired from the force. They all felt the pain in their ears as the ringing followed. Continuing with his forward momentum, Todd closed in, landing a powerful fist to the soldier's temple, causing him to collapse to the floor. "You good?" Todd asked, seeing little movement from the darker part of the room where Ken and the guard had landed. "Yeah. Get his weapon and let's move," Ken directed, knowing that Todd was probably already doing just that. The two began moving to the stairs. "What now?" Ken asked as they neared the top. "Now we search what is left of this place for Angelique," Todd almost growled. On the way into their makeshift cells, they saw that most of the building had been blown away by the attack on the fort, and now the door led to the outside. Seeing light coming from under the door, Ken looked back at Todd. My internal clock must be off. I could have sworn it would still be night out. Opening the door and stepping through, Ken could tell it was still night. I didn't think the light looked quite right, Ken said, as he and Todd stood staring into the lights of at least 2 vehicles facing them, each with personnel moving around with weapons aimed. Gentlemen, they both instantly recognized First Sergeant Thomas's voice. Before I give any orders, I want to know one thing. Are my men still alive? Thomas stood in front of her men, with her hands behind her back and her feet slightly separated. Yes, we don't kill fellow soldiers or keep them against their will, Todd replied sharply. Well then, it looks like we may be able to work together. As she spoke, Todd and Ken could see her gesture to her men to lower their weapons, as the light danced around her every movement. A moment later, 2 soldiers walked past them, heading into the shower room carrying medic bags. Standing in place, Todd and Ken watched the soldiers loading up into the vehicles. You 2 coming? Thomas asked as if they were old friends. Knowing that they had been split up to make getting information easier and to prevent them from escaping, Todd asked, Where is Gabe? Over here, let's go! Gabe's voice called from one of the vehicles. Without another question, Todd began walking over with Ken following close behind. Once again entering the basement where Angelique had been taken, Todd pictured the event as it had played out, still trying to figure out what he could have done to prevent them from taking her. And as he had every other time, he came to the same conclusion. Nothing. Little was said on the way back from where they had been holding Todd and Ken. They could feel that the way Thomas saw them had changed, so they followed her lead. Thomas stopped short of her office door and turned around to the 5 people following her. In front of, and at the end of the line, were her own men with weapons in hand. She spoke to them first. Ramos, Johnson, get these men their weapons and gear. Shocked by the order, the 2 hesitantly broke from the line and left to do as ordered. Thomas stared at the 3 men who were obviously eager to hear what she had to say next. Although I'm not fully convinced of your group's intentions, there is one thing that I'm sure of. They are Americans, and the men who took your friend were not. Thomas paused as the 2 soldiers returned with the weapons they had removed from the Chinese transport. Not knowing which weapons belonged to whom, the soldiers stood in place as Ken, Todd, and Gabe retrieved them. Todd was the first to notice a problem with the weapons. They weren't missing parts or ammunition. They had been returned with plenty and in working order. The problem he spotted was that there was only one Colt 1911. Calmly, Todd looked the 2 soldiers in the eye. Are there more where you brought these from? No, we brought everything, Johnson stated with a hint of fear in his voice. While checking hhis H&K 9mm pistol before sliding it back into its holster, Todd stole a few glances at the soldiers that said, I'm not done with you. With his pistol in its holster, his rifle over his shoulder, and a smaller pistol placed in his pocket, he reached out and picked up the Colt 1911 that belonged to Angelique. You see this? I want you to take a really good look at it. Todd turned it side to side and then showed them the bottom and top. You got a good look? Todd now gave them a good look down the barrel. Both Ramos and Johnson unsuccessfully moved their heads side to side so as not to be in direct aim of the pistol. Okay, now there is another one just like this one. It had better be on that desk over there when I come out of that office, or its twin here is going to be very angry. Got it? Todd said, not once letting his tone become aggressive or loud. The 2 men knew just what he meant and left after looking over to Thomas, who had listened to the conversation and gave them a nod to exit. Master Sergeant, the next time someone gives you your weapons back, it is probably best not to point them at her men, Thomas said sarcastically before entering her office. Following Thomas in one after another, Ken and Gabe looked over to Todd with expressions of approval on their faces. Standing behind her desk, Thomas faced the 3 men as they stood behind the chairs, waiting to hear what she had to say. Gentlemen, After a lengthy conversation with Gabe here on what all had transpired in St. Louis and the events leading up to last night, I decided to send out 2 men to do some recon, not to St. Louis, but to locate your friend." Thomas paused, still having a little difficulty with her recent decision. "They located where Miss Carringer is being held." "Where?" Ken asked. "Let's go get her," Todd exclaimed. Thomas put up her hand to quiet the two before continuing. "I'm afraid it isn't good. She's being held in a small town north of here called Rocktown, and it is heavily manned by UN troops." Todd and Ken looked at each other before Todd spoke. "We wondered where they were hiding. We have dealt with them before. Where are they holding her in the town? I had a house not too far from there before all this started, so I know the area." Thomas was prepared for such a question. Reaching to a rolled-up map on her desk, she spread it out and weighed down the corners with objects. "This is the newest map my personnel could find of the area. Luckily, small towns like this one don't change that much." With the map out where everyone could see, Thomas explained the situation as she pointed to a building on the map. "Right here. It was built a few years ago at the school." "I know that building," Todd said. "It was built with FEMA funding as a storm shelter. Always wondered why they would build it so tall if it was meant to protect people from storms. Apparently, its true purpose was to be a holding area. My men spoke with a few locals, and they said there has been a lot of construction going on there. The school has been turned into a prison, which is holding a large number of people. They have snipers on the roofs and guards patrolling the grounds. That is about all the information I have for you. They reported at least 100. Thomas wondered just how many more places like this were built under the pretext of helping the communities. "Okay, if we come in from the south and—" Thomas cut Todd off before he could continue outlining his plan. "I get that you want your friend back, but I cannot send what men I have to attack a fortified position." Thomas stood up straight, prepared for them to push back on her decision. "What the hell are you talking about, First Sergeant?" Ken asked. Gabe looked around the room at the other 3, not quiet, believing what he had heard. Up until now, he believed they had been preparing an attack. "No, the First Sergeant is right." Upon hearing the words calmly flowing from Todd's lips, Ken's objections fell silent as he and Gabe stared at him in disbelief. "We need to get back to the armory," Todd said calmly. "Get back? Just leave her with that lunatic?" Ken asked, his voice filled with anger. "Yes. A half-assed attempt will only get Angelique and many others killed. We have the manpower and supplies. We also need to inform them of what is heading this way from St. Louis before it's too late." Even though Ken and Gabe knew that what Todd was saying was right, the thought of leaving Angelique captive was hard to handle. With a touch of despair in his voice, Ken looked back to Thomas and said, "We are going to need the vehicle we arrived in." Surprised by the outcome, Thomas walked around her desk toward the door. "Don't take my decision to mean that I don't want to help." Stopping with her hand on the doorknob, she looked over the 3 men. "I need the help of your UCM, and you need ours if we are going to save this country." Thomas lowered her head at the thought of what she had just said, not of joining with the militia to save the country, but of the need to fight to save it from what it had become. Exiting Thomas's office, Todd looked to a desk just outside the door. On it was Angelique's Colt 1911s.